You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium, available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean, and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about the Boston Molasses Disaster of 1919. So it's over to you now, Mark.
The Boston Molasses Disaster, which is also known as the Great Molasses Flood, was a disaster that occurred on the Wednesday of the 15th of January back in 1919 in the North End neighbourhood of Boston, Massachusetts. It all started when a large storage tank filled with 2.3 million US gallons of molasses that weighed approximately 13,000 short tons or 12,000 metric tons burst open. The resultant wave of molasses rushed through the streets of Boston at an estimated 35 miles per hour, and on its journey it killed 21 people and injured another 150 people. The Boston Molasses Disaster has since become a staple tale of local culture, not just for the damage the flood had caused, but also for the sweet smell of the air that filled the North End neighbourhood of Boston for decades after. So popular was the event that it has even been recently named as the Boston Molassica. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in again and listening to this beer-swelling episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a psychic medium, a ufologist and a true crime buff. And just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every Monday night I do a podcast on the various subjects under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, and missing people. So if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any other of the podcast platforms, again, just give us a like and a follow. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the misadventurous story surrounding the Boston Molasses Disaster of 1919. And this week's necessary disclaimer. This story is a tale that sadly involves both people and animals, all dying through misadventure, and so may prove upsetting to some. As always, you listen at your own discretion, and also all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case still remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English, although it is my first and only language, after a few beers, I have found that I can talk hundreds of different languages, with none of them making any sense whatsoever. Anyway, let's get back to this week's story. Part 1 is a little bit of a history lesson, to be honest, but I think you might find it kind of interesting. I know I did. According to Wikipedia, Boston, or otherwise officially known as the City of Boston, was founded on the Shawmut Peninsula in 1630 by Puritan settlers. It is the capital and most populous city in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the United States. The city of Boston serves as the cultural and financial centre of the New England region of the northeastern United States, with an area of 48.4 square miles and, as recorded in the 2020 census, has a population of 675,647 people, making it the third largest city in the northeast, after both New York City and Philadelphia. The city was named after the town of Boston on the east side of the UK in Lincolnshire, England. During the early years of the 20th century, there were many architecturally significant buildings in the city of Boston, with one of them being the Boston Opera House and one of the others being the Logan International Airport, which opened on the 8th of September 1923. The professional ice hockey team, the Boston Bruins, were founded in 1924 and played their first game at the Boston Garden in November 1928. The city of Boston went into decline by the early to mid-20th century, and businesses moved out of the region for cheaper labour elsewhere. The city of Boston responded to this decline by initiating various urban renewal projects under the direction of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, or the BRA for short, which was established in 1957. In 1958, the BRA initiated a project to improve the historic West End of the Boston neighbourhood with extensive demolition that was met with strong public opposition and thousands of families being displaced, which is not the best of situations to be in. As we move forward a few decades, in 2016, the city of Boston briefly shouldered a bid as the US applicant for the 2024 Summer Olympic Games. This bid, however, was eventually dropped due to public opposition, leading the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, or otherwise known as the USOPC for short, selecting Los Angeles to be the American candidate, with LA ultimately securing the right to host the 2028 Summer Olympic Games. So, getting back to the matter in hand, the first question is, what is molasses? Well, putting it in basic terms, molasses is a byproduct that is principally obtained from the refining of sugarcane or sugar beet juice into sugar. The word molasses comes from the Portuguese language, simply meaning honey. Molasses varies in three different factors. 1, the amount of sugar. 2, the method of extraction. And 3, the age of the sugarcane plant. The most common use for sugarcane molasses is to sweeten and flavour foods, with it also being a major constituent of fine commercial brown sugar. Molasses was, and still is, historically popular in the Americas before the 20th century as a sweetener, which is, with its use, still common even today in a lot of traditional cuisine. Molasses itself is said to be rich in vitamins and minerals, including vitamin B6, iron, calcium, magnesium and potassium. And from what I can gather, there are various different types of molasses. Included among the different types are first molasses, which has the highest content of sugar. Then there is the second molasses, which has a slightly bitter taste, and one called blackstrap molasses, which is the darkest and most robust in flavour. The unique flavour and nutritional profile of molasses makes it a versatile ingredient with both food and non-food applications. And in addition to its culinary uses, molasses also has industrial applications, such as in the distillation of rum, additive in mortar, and a soil amendment to promote microbial activity. On a short but interesting side note here, microbial activity, or microorganism or microbe, is an organism which is of microscopic size. The microbiome may exist in its single-celled form or as a colony of cells. Molasses can also be fermented to produce ethanol, which is the active ingredient in alcoholic beverages and a key component in munitions, meaning both military weapons and ammunition. After this first short break, in part 2 we will look at the start of the molasses flood and the devastation that it caused.
This show is brought to you courtesy of Neil Packer and the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Find them online at www.hauntedresearchcentre.com or at 9 to 11 Regent Street, Hinckley, LE10 1AW. Open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for guided tours of the haunted rooms at just £3 per person. Booking is essential at all times, and over 16s only, please, unless accompanied by an adult. The haunted rooms are extremely haunted, and paranormal activity could and has taken place at any time. Some areas and particular objects or items can be quite scary and unnerving. Membership is available for £25 to qualify for selective offers. And why not download the app, available on both iOS and Android, for only $3.99, to keep up to date with what is coming up at the centre.
The Boston Molasses Disaster occurred at a chemical firm known as the Purity Distilling Company facility, based at 529 Commercial Street, near Keeney Square. There was always a considerable amount of molasses being stored there by the Purity Distilling facility, which used the Harbourside Commercial Street tank to offload molasses from ships and then store it to be later transferred by pipeline to the Purity ethanol plant that was situated between Willow Street and Everty's Way in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The molasses tank in question stood at about 50 feet or 15 metres tall and at around 90 feet or 27 metres in diameter, and contained as much as 2.3 million US gallons. As previously said, it all started on the 15th of January 1919, when the temperatures for the city of Boston had risen above 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius, and continued to climb rapidly from the frigid temperatures of the preceding days. The previous day, on the 14th, a cargo ship had delivered a fresh load of molasses, which had been warmed to reduce its viscosity to make the transfer easier. On an interesting side note, the viscosity of a fluid is a measure of its resistance to deformation at a given rate. For liquids, it corresponds to the informal concept of thickness, one example being that syrup has a higher viscosity than water. Viscosity is defined scientifically as force multiplied by time divided by area. Once the fresh new delivery of molasses was pumped into the 50-foot tall tank at approximately 12:30 p.m. that same day, the tank suddenly burst open and collapsed. Some witnesses reported that they felt the ground shake and heard a roar as the tank burst open, with others claiming that they heard a long rumbling noise similar to the passing of an elevated train. And some witnesses reported hearing things that sounded like a tremendous crashing or a deep growling and a thunderclap like bang. They even heard a sound like a machine gun being fired as the rivets of the 50-foot tall tank shot out and hit various other parts of the factory. On an interesting but mathematical side note, and to give you some idea of the force of the molasses wave, the density of molasses is about 1.4 metric tons per cubic metre. That's about 12 pounds per US gallon, which makes it 40% denser than water. This does mean, of course, that a molasses wave has a great deal more potential energy. So, with the molasses tank now completely collapsed, this meant that the energy wave of the thick liquid reached 25 feet high at its peak and moved at a peak speed of at least 35 miles per hour. To give you an example of how strong this molasses wave was, it was sufficiently strong enough to force the drive steel panels of the burst tank against the girders of the adjacent Boston Elevated Railway's Atlantic Avenue structure, and at the same time tip a streetcar momentarily completely off its axis. Stephen Poolar, who was a historian, teacher and author, described how the nearby buildings were swept off their foundations and totally crushed, and how several blocks were actually flooded to a depth of between 2 to 3 feet. Various quotes from Stephen Poolar from the Boston Post reported him saying, and I quote, "Molasses waist deep covered the streets and swirled and bubbled around the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form, whether it was animal or human being, it was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky or fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women suffered likewise." The Boston Globe also reported that people, and I quote,
were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet.
Meanwhile, other witnesses had various types of debris hurled at them from the rush of the sweet-scented wind, and a truck that was picked up and hurled into a nearby Boston harbour. After this sweet-smelling first initial wave, the molasses cooled down and started to become thick and sticky, otherwise known as more viscous. And as a result of this, it trapped those who were caught in the wave, making them more difficult to rescue. In total, about 150 people were injured, and a further 21 people, along with several horses, were killed. Some people were crushed and drowned by the molasses or by the debris that it carried along with it. The wounded included people, horses and dogs, with coughing fits becoming one of the most common ailments after the initial blast. Journalist and author Edward Parks wrote of one of the child's experiences in a 1983 article for the Smithsonian magazine. It said, and I quote, Anthony DiStasio, walking homeward with his sister from the Michelangelo school, was picked up by the wave and carried, tumbling on its crest, almost as though he was surfing. Then he grounded and the molasses rolled him like a pebble as the wave diminished. He heard his mother call his name and couldn't answer. His throat was so clogged with the smothering goo. He passed out, then opened his eyes to find 3 of his 4 sisters staring at him. On an interesting side note, the Smithsonian is a science and nature magazine and is the official journal published by the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. The Smithsonian holds events such as the American Ingenuity Awards and FutureCon, along with Museum Day. The Smithsonian magazine's first issue was published back in April 1970. The first people to arrive at the scene to start the rescue were 116 cadets, who were under the direction of Lieutenant Commander H.J. Copeland from the USS Nantucket that was docked nearby at the playground pier. The 116 cadets ran several blocks towards the molasses accident and entered into the knee-deep flood of sticky liquid to pull out survivors. Meanwhile, other cadets worked to keep out any curious onlookers and stop them from getting in the way of the rescue. Soon, more help arrived on the scene in the shape of Navy personnel, the Boston Police Force, the Red Cross, and the Army. Some of the nurses from the Red Cross, instead of hanging around and waiting for any of the injured people to be brought to them, took the initiative and just drove straight into the thick, sticky molasses themselves to help with the rescue. Now, you see, that's what I like. Well done, girls. Out of the box thinking. None of this waiting around for risk assessment, tick box nonsense. Just straight down to business. Saving lives. Yes. Meanwhile, some of the other nurses from the Red Cross looked after any of the injured by giving them emergency first aid, keeping them warm and feeding them, along with any of the other exhausted rescuers. Many of the rescuers worked through the night, and due to the amount of people that were injured, the doctors and surgeons decided to set up a makeshift hospital in a nearby building. Many rescuers found it too difficult to make their way through the thick, sticky syrup in order to help some of the victims, and so 4 days after much searching, they took the difficult decision to stop the rescue altogether. Now, to be honest, 4 days doesn't seem that long to me, but I suppose it was back in 1919 when things were just different. Many of the dead victims were so glazed over in the molasses that it was too difficult to recognise who they were, and other bodies that were found around 3 to 4 months after the molasses disaster had been found swept into the Boston harbour. After this second short break, in part 3, we will look at the wake of the molasses accident, the clean-up operation, and the possible causes.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07 852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk, or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
The clean-up operation in the immediate local area to where the molasses disaster had happened took many weeks, with several hundred people helping to clear up the sticky mess, and it took even longer to clean up the rest of the greater Boston area and its suburbs. To clean up the sticky molasses, the clean-up crews used salt water from a fireboat to help wash it away, and sand to help absorb the runnier parts. However, the Boston harbour was soon turned brown with molasses and stayed that way for a good 6-month period until the summer of that same year. One of the other ongoing problems with the clean-up operation was that the teams of rescue workers, clean-up crews and sightseers had actually traipsed the sticky molasses throughout the streets of Boston and spread it to the subway platforms, the seats inside the trains and streetcars, the paid telephone handsets, into homes and to countless other places within the Boston area. In fact, overall, it was reported by a witness that, and I quote,
"Everything that a Bostonian touched was sticky."
In the wake of the accident, 119 residents brought a first-class action lawsuit against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or the USIA for short, who, back in 1917, had brought the Purity Distilling Company facility where the disaster occurred. This lawsuit was one of the first class action suits in Massachusetts and is considered a milestone in paving the way for modern corporate regulations. The USIA originally claimed that the molasses tank in question had been blown up by anarchists because some of the alcohol produced within the tank was going to be used in making of munitions. However, after 3 years of constant hearings, a court-appointed auditor found the USIA responsible, and the company ultimately paid out $628,000 in damages, which works out in today's money to be approximately $11 million. With the relatives of those who were killed in the disaster reportedly receiving around $7,000 per victim, which again in today's money is the equivalent of $123,000 each. So, of course, the next big question is, why did this disaster happen? Well, there are several various factors that might have contributed to this almighty molasses cock-up. The first factor is that the molasses tank in question may have leaked from the very first day that it was filled, 4 years prior, in 1915. It also turns out that the molasses tank in question was constructed poorly and then insufficiently tested, so as a result it is possible that the carbon dioxide production might have raised the internal pressure due to fermentation within the tank. And if this is the case, then the warmer weather from the previous day would have assisted in building this internal pressure, and as the air temperature rose from 2 degrees Fahrenheit to 41 degrees Fahrenheit over that short period of time, with the initial failure occurring from a manhole cover near the base of the poorly constructed tank, a fatigue crack possibly grew until it reached a point of criticality. On a small but interesting side note, in materials science, fatigue is the initiation and propagation of cracks in a material due to cyclic loading. Once a fatigue crack has initiated, it grows a very small amount with each loading cycle, typically producing weakness on some parts of the fractured surface. The crack will continue to grow until it reaches a critical size, which occurs when the stress intensity factor of the crack exceeds the fracture's toughness of the material, producing rapid propagation and typically completing the fracture of the structure. It was soon discovered during an investigation afterwards that the molasses tank in question had been filled to capacity only 8 times since it was built a few years earlier, putting the walls of the tank either under an intermittent or a continuous and repeated application, otherwise known as a cyclical load. There have been several authors claiming that the Purity Distilling Company facility where the disaster occurred was trying to outrace prohibition, as the 18th Amendment to the law was ratified the next day on the 16th of January 1919 and took effect 1 year later. In short, the Prohibition era was the period from 1920 to 1933, when the United States prohibited the production, importation, transportation and the sale of alcoholic beverages. The alcohol industry was curtailed by a succession of state legislatures and finally ended nationwide under the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution and ratified on the 16th of January 1919. Prohibition ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment on the 5th of December 1933. An inquiry after the molasses disaster revealed that the USIA's treasurer, a Mr. Arthur Gell, neglected basic safety tests while overseeing construction of the tank in question, such as filling it with water to check for leaks and ignoring warning signs such as creaking and groaning noises each time the tank was filled. It was also found out during the inquiry that when the tank in question was filled with molasses, it leaked so badly that it was painted brown on the outside to hide the leakage stains.
Seriously?
But not only that. To add insult to injury, this USIA's treasurer, Arthur Gell, had absolutely no architectural or engineering experience. In a 2014 investigation, a modern engineering analysis was applied to this now over 100-year-old case, and it was found out that the steel tank was only half as thick as it should have been for a tank of its size, even with the lower standards that they had back then in 1919. Another issue that was found was that the steel tank lacked manganese, and as a result of this, it was made more brittle. And not only that, but during the modern engineering analysis, it was found that the tank's rivets were also apparently flawed, with cracks at the rivet holes. On a short but interesting side note, manganese is a chemical element. It is hard, brittle, silvery metal, often found in minerals in combination with iron that improves strength, workability and resistance to wear. Manganese was first isolated as an element in the 1770s. Move forward a couple of years to 2016, and a team of scientists and students at Harvard University conducted their own extensive studies of the molasses disaster by gathering data from many various sources, including some 1990 newspaper articles, old maps, and even a weather report for the area around that time. The student researchers started by studying the behaviour of cold corn syrup by flooding a scale model of the affected Boston neighbourhood, concluding that the reports of the high-speed flood of molasses through the Boston streets were indeed very credible. The students also found out that 2 days before the molasses disaster, warmer molasses had already been added to the tank, which reduced the viscosity of the fluid. Oh, get it out of my mouth. So, when the molasses tank collapsed, the liquid cooled very quickly as it spread around the neighbourhood, until it finally reached Boston's winter evening temperatures, and the viscosity increased dramatically. In other words, it got thicker. The Harvard students concluded that the molasses cooled and thickened quickly as it rushed through the Boston streets, hampering efforts to free any victims before they suffocated. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or the USIA, never did rebuild the tank. The property formerly occupied by the molasses tank became a yard for the Boston Elevated Railway, which was the predecessor to the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. The area is now the site of a city-owned recreational complex, officially called Langan Park, and immediately to the east is a larger recreational area called Poolar Park. The accident has since become something of a staple local culture, but not just for the damage the flood brought or the lives it took with it, but also for the sweet smell of treacle that filled the north end of Boston for decades later. On the 15th of January 2019, exactly 100 years after the event, an anniversary ceremony was held in remembrance. And by using ground-penetrating radar, locals were able to identify the exact location of the original tank from 1919. They found that the original concrete slab base for the tank still remains in place, approximately 20 inches below the surface of the baseball diamond at Langan Park. The attendees of the ceremony all stood in a circle marking the edge of the tank, and the 21 names of those who died in or as a result of the molasses flood was read aloud. There is a small plaque at the entrance of Poolar Park, placed by the Bostonian Society commemorating the disaster. The plaque is titled Boston Molasses Flood, and it reads,
On January the 15th, 1919, a molasses tank at 529 Commercial Street exploded under pressure, killing 21 people. A 40-foot wave of molasses buckled the elevated railroad tracks, crushed buildings and inundated the neighbourhood. Structural defects in the tank, combined with unseasonably warm temperatures, contributed to the disaster.
Many laws and regulations governing construction were changed as a direct result of the Boston Molasses Disaster of 1919. One of these laws, you will be pleased to know, includes the requirement of oversight by a licensed architect and civil engineer.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 97, we are going to be looking at the history of Skid Row. Skid Row is a neighbourhood in downtown Los Angeles. The area is officially known as Central City East, containing one of the largest stable populations of homeless people in the United States, approximately between 9,200 to 15,000 people. And it has been known for its condensed homeless population since at least the 1930s. Its long history of police raids, targeted city initiatives and homelessness advocacy make it one of the most notable districts in Los Angeles.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations of all the names of places, though, was all mine. I don't think it was too bad this week. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar, with special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley, and a big thank you to everyone for listening. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.